It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the OSD on-screen display menu system of the Acer Predator X32 FP. The OSD is controlled by buttons and a joystick, and they're found at the rear of the screen towards the right side as viewed from the front. The top button is the power button. If you press any of your other buttons or press the joystick, then it gives you a little quick menu. The first three buttons there, they're shortcut keys. You can configure them in the menu. So they're in System, Hotkey Assignment. I do apologise, I want three of them. It's only the first and second button, or second and third button, because the first button's the power button, which you can reconfigure. So you can see a few different options there. Modes, volume, gamma, contrast, low blue light, overdrive, and back to modes. And I will go through these specific settings in more detail when I get to them in the main menu. Same with Hotkey 2. The third one there, input, that's always input. So you can select the input used by the monitor, and you can have auto source selected if you want it to decide which input to use for you. Be aware that the monitor has quite a few different inputs, and auto source can take a while to actually detect the correct source. If you find it's slowly cycling through the inputs that's annoying you, then have that set to off and manually select the input yourself. For convenience, it may take a bit longer sometimes, but have auto source set to on. So into the main menu, press the joystick in to access that. Before going through all of the settings, I'd like to address the question, what are the best settings for this monitor? And by best, I mean settings which work for me and that please my colorimeter, the targets I like to follow in my reviews, and that work on my unit. Of course, different units, individual preferences, this will all vary. So these are just a suggestion. These are what I use for my test settings in the review. So the first thing to be aware of with this monitor, if you make changes to any of the presets, it will then knock you into mode user. This isn't if you make any change, this is just if you make changes to things which can be set in each preset. So there are some settings which are set universally and will apply to all presets. That won't knock you into user mode, but don't worry too much about if it does or doesn't. I'll give you some examples of settings which are set universally shortly. But the idea is if you make some changes here, it could even be something simple like changing the brightness, and you just want to be able to quickly recall the preset and you don't want to worry about it not saving your changes. When it knocks you into the user mode, it says Save Settings To, and that allows you to save it to Game Mode Action, Game Mode Racing, and Sports. So if I go into Modes, which I have my hotkeys set to, which is something I explored earlier in the OSD video, you can see there's Action, Racing, and Sports, also called G1, G2, and G3. So these are basically your main sets of settings saved there. Action G1 is actually what I use for my test settings. I set brightness to 36 because that is an appropriate level for the 160 nits that I typically target when I review monitors. This is something you would set according to your own preferences and lighting environment, however. You also want to make sure that max brightness is set to on. If this is set to off, then it will limit the monitor's brightness to, I think it's about 60 nits, it's really dim. So if the monitor looks super dim, even though you've got your brightness set to 100, that will be why. Contrast I'd recommend leaving at the default of 50, that should be optimal. Low blue light is something you might want to use if you want to create a more relaxing viewing experience. It's something that I like to use in the evenings and the hours leading up towards bed. And I actually have that set to Sports or G3 so I can quickly activate that. But all I've actually done here, it's set up in the same way as my test settings, except that low blue light is set to level 4. Actually, I believe the brightness might be a tiny bit higher than my test settings. I don't think that was actually intentional, but that's easily rectified. So I can just reduce that a little bit to 36 because I don't mind that. Save settings to Sports. Be aware as well that if you're using a low blue light setting like this and you've got the brightness set as you did before, then it will actually be dimmer because the low blue light settings make color channel adjustments which reduce your contrast and reduce your brightness. And that's all explored in the Vision review in the contrast and brightness section. Also be aware that when I first set my test settings up, so I'm just going to go back to my test settings, Action, I actually used standard, the standard preset as the base. So anything that I'm not talking about here that I haven't changed, that was just set as default in the standard setting. I'm just going to quickly talk about some of the other settings. So there's Eco. This is just quite dim by default. Actually, it's not dim. It's dimmer than standard by default, but it's not as dim as I like to have things. So it's not as dim as my own test settings, meaning that technically my test settings use less power than Eco. But that's basically all it does. Graphics, and that sets to a high brightness by default. 97 for some reason. I don't know why they didn't just go all the way up to 100, but 97 it is. And remember, if I change this, it then knocks me into mode user, and I would have to save my preferred settings to save settings too. And there's HDR, which is actually important, and that is a preset you have to use when you're using HDR on the monitor. Gamma 2.2 was good on my unit. Color temperature, I set that to user. That was set to warm by default using standard, and actually that was quite well balanced, but I still wanted to make a few changes just to get things closer to my 6500K target and have a really nice neutral green channel. So for me, red gain was set to 48, green gain 48, and blue gain 50, which is the default. The bias controls also set to the defaults. These kind of shift the gamma curve of the color channels. It's not something I'd recommend most people play around with, but if you like to tweak things like that and you like to make some slight changes and you prefer how things look with the bias settings changed, then by all means do that. So to give an example of an extreme adjustment, it now gives everything a strange red tint, as if a very odd filter's applied. But really the gain controls are the main RGB controls. Most monitors will just have RGB, the main three color channels, and they're your gain controls. So they're the main ones to focus on. I also left the color space in standard. If you want to use sRGB emulation, so you want to restrict your color gamut, you don't want oversaturation for standard sRGB applications, you don't want to be using ICC profiles, you don't want to worry about any of that, and you might not be using color aware applications which would use them anyway. You can set that to sRGB. And with this, it does grey out some settings. You can adjust the brightness according to your preferences, however. It seems to set super sharpness to on. That really just over sharpens the image. It can be useful for non-native resolutions if you're using them, but if you're using the native 4K UHD resolution, I would recommend just setting super sharpness to off. This monitor has an excellent pixel density, lots of sharpness natively. You don't really need to enhance that or over sharpen that. Other thing to be aware of, if you've changed the color space to sRGB, you can't change the color channels. So I can't scroll up here and get to the color channels. So now I cycle back to standard. It's just actually knocked me into standard mode, which isn't what I was using before. So it does take a little bit of getting used to this OSD. It's the same on other Acer monitors, so I am used to it. So that's why you should be saving things to G1, G2 or G3. It just makes it easier to recall settings. So to quickly recap, I changed the brightness. I was using standard as my base. I made sure max brightness is set to on. Made some changes to the color channels. Other settings of interest, under gaming, there's an overdrive setting, and my recommendation there is to set that to normal and see how you find it. If you find that the overshoot's too high, then set that to off. If you have FreeSync Premium Pro active, so you want to be using VRR, specifically you want to be using adaptive sync, then that greys out the overdrive control and it's locked at normal. And it always locks it at normal, or it behaves like normal anyway. Adaptive dimming, and that's something which is explored in some detail in the written review and also explored in the video review. I have that set to off the desktop because I don't like to use this kind of setting on the desktop. It's a local dimming solution, the 576 zone local dimming. I like to set this to average when I'm gaming casually under SDR. I like to have this set to average always under HDR as well. And if I'm watching video content under SDR, sometimes I have this on average as well. Kind of just depends how I feel, to be honest. Remember, I'm still in SDR now. You can adjust the brightness. I'd recommend setting it to a similar value you had before. And if you want things to be more dynamic and you don't mind a bit of extra brightness, you can drag that up. But this is all explored again in more detail in the review. I would also generally recommend setting auto source to off. I know I mentioned this before, but that was actually a little bit before I started talking about the best settings. This monitor has a lot of different ports. It seems to sometimes slowly cycle through them before choosing the appropriate port, and it just takes a little bit of extra time. So if you have this set to off, it should start up quicker. It doesn't always do this cycling, I've noticed, but sometimes it does, and it can get a bit annoying, to be honest. So I would recommend manually selecting the port if you can. HDMI black level, that should be set to normal by default. Leave it there. unless you're using a system which needs a limited range RGB signal, perhaps a Nintendo Switch. I think they work better with a limited range RGB signal, in which case you can set that to low. Interestingly, I'm actually using DisplayPort and it still has the HDMI black level control, but regardless of whether I'm using a full range or limited range signal with DisplayPort, this doesn't have any effect, so it should really be grayed out. But it isn't, never mind, just leave it on normal anyway. Quick start mode is another thing you might want to have enabled. If you have this disabled, which is the default state, it's going to turn the monitor off. I'm turning on now. It does take a little bit of time to switch on this monitor. It then displays these little, you saw it displayed the logo. And if I had automatic port selection enabled, it might have also taken even longer because it might have cycled through the ports before it found the correct one, which can be quite annoying. So I'm just going to turn quick start mode on. I'm now turning the monitor on. Still takes a bit of time. It doesn't make it super quick, but it doesn't display those logos and it is a bit quicker to start up. HDMI 2.1, it's just a little trick here I will mention. I did notice once when I was using HDMI 2.1 on the monitor, for some reason I could only select 160 Hz, and that was the only listed resolution. It's like it had scrambled the EDID somehow. If I turned HDMI 2.1 off then on again, it had all the correct resolutions listed. I haven't noticed it doing this again, so I'm not sure what caused that behavior. I was using my AMD GPU and I just plugged my NVIDIA GPU in again, so it could have been that that caused some issue temporarily, but this was cleared by simply switching HDMI 2.1 to off then on again. Then it had the full range of refresh rates listed. And just the final thing we need to pay attention to is DSC. You will want to use that for the full capabilities of the monitor if you're using DisplayPort. Switching over the attention to HDR now, I'm just going to turn that on in Windows. As of firmware version 2.00.015, which was the one that was released in June 2023, the monitor will automatically go into its HDR operating mode when an HDR signal is detected. So you'll see that for the modes, everything's grayed out except for HDR, and that's what's selected. Now in terms of the best settings here, I would just quite happily leave everything at default, and that should be brightness set to 100. If you lower the brightness, you can do that for viewing comfort reasons, but it will upset the PQ curve of the monitor. It doesn't just map things neatly to a lower brightness. So what that means is that really everything's tuned for the brightness to be set to 100. But if for viewing comfort reasons you really just find that too much, that is of course important, so do reduce the brightness. Quite a lot of this is grayed out, contrast, ACM, max brightness, that's all grayed out, not relevant under HDR. Black boost, I would recommend not shifting this from the default of 5. It will upset the image and make significant changes there. You can manually disable HDR even if you've got an HDR signal by switching it off in the OSD, but there's no reason you'd want to do that. Will just give you a very dodgy image. I like to make sure that super sharpness is set to off. If you like a bit of a sharper look, that is to say an over sharpened look, and that is common on some monitors under HDR anyway, and you can turn super sharpness on or leave it on. I'm not entirely sure what the default was. It kind of changed between firmware revisions. For colour, just leaving that at colour temperature warm, which is the default, works well for my unit, or works well enough. You can select something else if you prefer. So if you notice a particular tint, you could set that to colour temperature user and then make adjustments. The adjustments here though, they're applied universally. So if you make adjustments under SDR, which I've done here, they carry over to HDR if you've got colour temp set to user there. Unfortunately, the calibration tends to be different in terms of white point and overall colour channel balance comparing SDR to HDR, so you probably want to make different adjustments if you really want to optimize things here. So that can be quite annoying, to be honest. It means you have to change this every time you go over to SDR or HDR. So it is possible, but it is easier to just leave things at the default setting of warm, so try to get used to that. Hopefully it looks okay on your unit anyway. I also like to set adaptive dimming to average. This is all explored in the review, the different settings here, but I would definitely recommend at least enabling that setting under HDR. So that's really all I change. I make sure super sharpness is disabled, I make sure the brightness is set to 100, and I set adaptive dimming to my preferred setting of average. I'm now going to go through the remaining settings. Black boost. It's designed to give a competitive edge. I'm not even going to bother darkening the room and showing you this in immense detail because it's quite obvious what it does. If you Set this even to 6, it significantly lightens up dark shades. I suppose it is good competitively, but it also raises the black depth. Raise this further, and it really gives a completely flooded look to the image. I much prefer these settings when they don't mess up the contrast and they're more selective, but this makes really heavy-handed adjustments, as you can see. If you reduce this, then it starts crushing details, gives a more contrasty look in some respects, I guess. You might like that, but I'd recommend just leaving this at 5, which is the default. There's ACM, which is grayed out, unless you disable adaptive dimming, which I've now done. And this is, I think it stands for Acer contrast management or something. It's just a dynamic contrast setting. If you want to use that kind of thing, then really you've got the local dimming. The adaptive dimming is a much better solution for that. Super sharpness and max brightness I've already been through. Color, I've been through these settings, but just to show you the different gamma settings, because I didn't go through these, I just mentioned 2.2 worked well on my unit. There's 2.0, 1.8, 2.6, 2.4 and 2.2. I've been through the gains and bias controls already as modes. That just gets you onto the mode screen, which I've shown you a few times already. I showed you a few of the color space settings. I showed you sRGB and standard. They're the main ones I would focus on, but there are some others. There's Rec 709. This will give you a gamma of 2.4 by default. It is also an sRGB emulation setting, so it will clamp the gamut closer to sRGB, and it restricts you in the same way. You can't change the color channels, you can't change the gamma, but you can change the brightness. EBU, I'm not really familiar with that. DCI, this clamps the gamut close to the DCI P3 color space, or closer than native, but it also sets the gamma rather high. I measured 2.7 average. I think it should be 2.6, but just inter-unit variation there. But you can't change the gamma, you can't change the color channels, you can change the brightness again. There's SMPTEC, again, not really familiar with that one. And back to standard. There's grayscale mode, which does what it says on the tin, makes everything grayscale. 6-axis hue adjustments, if you really like to tweak this kind of thing, you can. Wouldn't recommend you do this unless you need to or really like to. So it's just another way of fine-tuning the image. I'm not going to go through all of these, it will take a while. 6-axis means there's red, green, blue, yellow, magenta and cyan controls here. And reset, which will reset the hue controls to the factory defaults. There's also the same for saturation, perhaps more useful. If you want to tweak the saturation levels, you're finding red a little bit too saturated, perhaps you'll reduce that. It's difficult to get the balance right though. I find that some red shades become undersaturated before others, so it's very difficult to balance it in this way. I'd recommend using sRGB emulation to reduce saturation. But if you just want to reduce saturation a little bit, then you can do this, and it's nice having 6-axis control of this anyway. And if you want to increase saturation levels, you can also do that. Remember that you're pulling shades closer to the edge of the gamut by doing this, but you're not expanding the gamut itself, so you lose shade variety. Crush things together. And you can reset the saturation controls to the factory default values of 50. Next is audio. You can change the volume of the integrated speakers, or you can mute them. And this would control things connected to the 3.5mm jack if you're using that instead. Next is gaming. Overdrive, which I've been through. There was also an extreme setting I didn't even mention, but that is explored in the review. It's not really very useful at all. It just gives you extreme overshoot. FreeSync Premium Pro, which as I mentioned is your adaptive sync control. You don't need to use that for HDMI 2.1 VRR. Refresh rate num. This gives you a nice and fairly clear number. At the top right of the screen it says 160 for 160 Hz. If the monitor is using VRR, that will fluctuate to reflect the frame rate if it's within the VRR window. If you're not using VRR, then it will just stick to the static refresh rate that you're using. Aim point, which I haven't been through, so it's icon 1, icon 2, icon 3, and that just very simply gives you a crosshair in the middle of the screen. Change the wallpaper so it's a little, that wasn't what I had in mind, so it's a bit clearer. There we are. And these particular settings, by the way, you can use them at the same time. So I've got the aim point and I've got the frame rate counter or refresh rate display at the same time. You can't change the design of this other than the 3 designs shown, by the way, and the color. You can't change it, so there's no customization with the crosshair. You can't adjust its position either, it's always right in the center of the screen. but you can actually save them to G1, G2 and G3. So if you have a game where you always like to use the crosshair feature and the frame rate counter, or one or the other, you can do that and they will activate automatically when you go back to your preset if you've saved it to that preset, G1, G2 or G3. Next is OSD, just some basic OSD controls. You can change the language that the OSD is displayed in, the timeout period, so how long after the last button press before it automatically disappears, where you can press the little X, the exit button, to get rid of it manually. And this is in seconds. You can set that between 10 and 120 seconds. If you want to enable a transparency effect at various different levels, you can do that. OSD Lock. OSD locked. Now I can't get back into the OSD, can't remember how to do it. Actually I can, because it's the same as other Acer monitors. You just want to hold the joystick to the right for a few seconds, then it says OSD unlock, and you can use it again. Then there's system. I've been through some of these, but you can select the input, auto source, which I've been through. Wide mode. Now this is applicable if you're running a non-native resolution. I've switched over to 2560 by 1440, QHD 1440p, and it's still grayed out. You also have to have FreeSync Premium Pro disabled in the OSD, so you can't use adaptive sync with this scaling setting as well. And you will have seen that it just fills up the screen by default, wide if you are using adaptive sync. So it's using interpolation, it's using all of the pixels of the display. And it still seems to be set to full, and it's grayed out. Very interesting. So, backtracking a bit on what I said, it might be because I have to have it set to a specific refresh rate. Let's try 120 Hz. Still grayed out. And let's try instead one of the refresh rates listed under Ultra HD HD SD. So 120 Hz Full HD. And when I go on information, by the way, I will show you this again later, but that's when you press that little I button there. It does say 1920 by 1080, but wide mode is grayed out. Interesting. So maybe I need to be using HDMI to activate these. I'm using HDMI now, grayed out at the native resolution. Let's try 120 Hz QHD. So still grayed out. If I go on I for information, you'll see it says resolution 3840 by 2160. That's because the monitor doesn't actually support scaling for 2560 by 1440. So it isn't accepting a QHD signal. So let's go again for one of the resolutions listed under Ultra HD HD SD instead. Still grayed out, no idea what's going on here or how exactly you get this to not be grayed out. Last thing I'm going to try is just 60 Hz Full HD. And by the way, yes, 120 Hz Full HD is supported on the scale of the monitor, incidentally. So 60 Hz now, Full HD. Still grayed out, so I guess I can't show you that setting. I don't know how exactly you unlock it. Maybe you need to have a very specific resolution and refresh rate, which I haven't tested, but a bit annoying to be honest. And just to confirm, the monitor does actually support QHD scaling at 60 Hz specifically, as well as at 144 Hz, but for some reason not at 120 Hz. Good news everyone, I managed to work it out several days later, actually when I was editing the OSD video. You need to have FreeSync Premium Pro set to off. You also have to have ultra low latency set to off. Then you can access wide mode. So I'm running the 2560 by 1440, 1440p QHD resolution at 144 Hz just at the moment. Full wide mode. There's aspect, which sticks to the aspect ratio, which is 16 by 9. And I've tested a range of other resolutions which aren't 16 by 9, and I couldn't find one which uses the scale of the monitor and actually shows something different for aspect. I'm not going to spend any more time doing that. You get the idea. It would show black borders if it's using the monitor's scaler and it's not 16 by 9, whereas full will fill up the entire screen. And there's 1:1, which only uses the pixels called for by the source resolution and will use a black border for all of the rest. Hotkey assignment, which I've been through. DDC/CI as part of the plug and play functionality, which will allow you to use software such as Acer Display Widget, which I'll show you shortly, to control the monitor. HDMI black level, which I've been through, quick start mode, which I've been through, USB port select. So this is the KVM function of the monitor basically. You select either B type or C type or automatic, and that will allow you to select which port is used for your upstream data. I believe if you have it set to automatic, then it can detect if data transfer is attempted. To be completely honest with you, I don't use KVM myself, so I haven't tested this specific feature, and I do have a lot to test in my review, so I don't really have time to fiddle around with this kind of thing too much. But it is the KVM feature. It does have USB-B and USB Type-C upstream ports, and it will allow you to reassign USB peripherals connected to the monitor to your USB-C or Type-B upstream port. As USB 3.0, this is controlling the USB 3 capability of the USB-C port. This is because, as usual for USB-C, you either select whether you want the full video capabilities or whether you want the bandwidth to go more towards data transfer. If you have USB 3 enabled, that will limit you to 60 Hz at the native 4K UHD resolution, whereas if you have USB 3 set to off, you've got USB 2.0 transfer speeds, I believe, but you have the full capabilities in terms of your video signal, which will include 3840 by 2160 at up to 160 Hz. HDMI 2.1, which I went through earlier. If you've got HDMI 2.1, then set that to on. It's compatibility, you can set it off. DSC, which I went through, applicable to DisplayPort, which I'm not using right now. Power off USB charge. If you have this set to on, it means that if the monitor is in standby, you can still use the USB ports to supply power to devices. If you do have this set to on though, be aware that it will use more standby power for the monitor, even if you're not actually using those USB ports to charge, which is why this is set to off by default. And I know I've shown you the information, the I section already, but I did say I'd revisit it, so let's do that quickly. So it just shows you the source that's being used, HDMI port 4 in my case at the moment, the resolution, horizontal and vertical frequency, with the V frequency there being the important one to pay attention to, the mode you're using. So if I switch on HDR, so it's now receiving an HDR signal, it now says mode normal HDR. And then there's the serial number, reset all settings, so that's your factory reset, and exit, so don't accidentally press this. So the final thing I'd like to show you is Acer Display Widget. This is downloadable on Acer's website, and there's a link to this in the description of the video. It's quite simple software. It's going to adjust the exposure of my camera so you can see this a bit more clearly. So you can change the preset very easily, and it very quickly activates different presets. Advanced settings allows you to change a few more things, but this doesn't give you the full capability, it doesn't give you full flexibility, so it takes a little while to get there. You can change the brightness, the contrast, low blue light levels, so you can set that if you want. And be aware that once you've done that, it puts you on the user setting again, and it's changed my brightness because I didn't have it set to 80 before. But if you press cancel, it'll just go back to the settings you were using before, which is quite nice. But if you make changes here that you do want to apply, for example, let's say I wanted to change the gamma to 2.4, then you can press OK and it does actually apply them. And it switches over to your user setting. The other things you could change here, just going to let it load up my action mode settings again. Color temperature. Something to be aware of though, it says here 50, 50, 50 for red, green and blue gains. So yeah, somehow it seems to have forgotten my preferred settings. I must have changed these at some point, or some settings have changed these. So that's another little annoyance that these are set universally rather than saved correctly to the preset. But anyway, if I set these all to, let's say 48, but then in the OSD it displays 44, and let's set this one to 40 and see what happens. Just have to open the OSD again. It's actually set to 24. So the values here are a load of rubbish. They don't correspond to the actual OSD values, so it's a bit weird. You can also set the black boost, the volume, refresh rate num. So that's the little thing at the top right of the screen showing you your current refresh rate. The overdrive setting, You have to go into the OSD to change FreeSync Premium Pro. Incidentally, you can't do it here because there isn't a setting for it. There's also Game View Sync. So it allows you to add an app. So I've just added Epic Online Services local application. That's just the first thing I happened to find. And you can change the preset that is going to be used when that is active. And remember that it has your G1, G2 and G3 modes as well if you prefer to use them. There's also a screen split function. So you have to turn that on, and then it just allows you to quickly rearrange windows, or it shows you little grey boxes where you can snap them to various positions. And it doesn't change the positions when you change them, it just gives you the guidelines for specific layouts and lets you snap them yourself. So it's a little bit clunky, to be honest. I actually find Windows 11's built-in feature better than this. I don't know what the G means and I don't know what the user means. Show preview if you want, but I mean, maybe some people would find this useful, but personally I'm not too fussed about it. There's Game Assistant, and you can change the crosshair style. If I activate aim point, you'll see that there are actually more options here. You can change the horizontal position a bit, you can change the vertical position a bit, you can change the colour, and there's some more styles which weren't included in the main OSD. So you do get more configuration options if you're using Display Widget for these. There's also a sniper setting which will zoom in to the midsection of the screen. I can see, that's quite trippy, I can see two mouse cursors, one normal and one large, and you can change it so it zooms in even more. You can have a middle scope or a large scope as well. And there's also a night vision setting which just gives a little sort of light intensifying fake filter, if you like that kind of thing. Hotkeys, you can set hotkeys for your aim point, sniper and night vision. So you can have it set to Control and N, for example, if you want to quickly toggle the aim point on and off. You can do the same with the joystick if you've got one. Settings as well, a few different options here. You can power the monitor off if you wish. Some basic information about the monitor, the software version, and check for update. This is not for the firmware of the monitor, this is just for the Display Widget application, and a few other settings, key lock, so another way of unlocking the monitor if you've accidentally locked the OSD here, run at startup, always on top, the usuals. USB port select, that is not applicable on this model, I assume, which is why it's grayed out there. Same with power indicator, you can't control that on this particular model. So that's really all there is to the OSD on-screen display menu system of the Acer Predator X32 FP. Be sure to check out the full review on PCmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. Also be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, a nice way of showing your support.